It was late November when my husband, Sam, a police officer, suggested we take a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods. We both needed a break. Sam's job had been especially demanding lately, and I'd been feeling overwhelmed at home. A quiet retreat sounded like the perfect escape, so I didn't hesitate when he showed me photos of a rustic cabin he'd found online. It was nestled in a remote part of the Adirondacks, surrounded by dense forests and nothing else. We arrived late Friday afternoon. The drive up had been uneventful, with the last stretch winding through thick, snow-dusted pines. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised. Small but cozy, with a wraparound porch and a wood-burning stove inside. The air smelled crisp, clean, and cold. Sam parked the truck, and we unloaded our bags. I noticed how quiet it was out there. No sounds of cars or voices, just the faint rustling of branches in the wind. The isolation felt peaceful at first, but there was something unnerving about it too. I brushed it off, telling myself I'd just gotten too used to the constant noise of the city. Inside, the cabin was simple but charming. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a couch and that stove, and a bedroom in the back. Sam quickly got to work starting a fire, and before long, the place was warm and inviting. That night, we cooked dinner together and ate by candlelight, laughing and talking about anything but work. I felt like we were finally reconnecting after months of stress. When we went to bed, the wind had picked up outside, howling against the windows. It was comforting, in a strange way, like nature was wrapping us in a cocoon. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The room was pitch dark except for the faint glow from the wood stove. For a moment, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I realized I could hear something soft, shuffling sounds coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal. But as I lay there, straining to listen, I realized it wasn't random. The sounds were deliberate, like footsteps moving through the snow. My stomach tightened. I turned to Sam, but he was sound asleep. I didn't want to wake him over what was probably nothing, so I stayed still, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped, and for a long time, everything was silent again. I convinced myself it had been my imagination and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I didn't mention what I'd heard. We spent the day hiking a nearby trail, enjoying the crisp air and breathtaking views. Sam was in a good mood, and I didn't want to spoil it with my silly paranoia. That night, after dinner, I stepped outside to get some fresh air while Sam cleaned up. The sky was clear, and the stars were brighter than I'd ever seen. I stood on the porch, breathing deeply, when I noticed something in the snow. Footprints. They were faint but definitely there, leading from the edge of the woods to the side of the cabin. My heart started pounding as I traced the path with my eyes. Whoever had made them had walked right up to the window by the kitchen before turning back toward the forest. I hurried inside, trying to act casual. "Were you outside earlier?" I asked Sam. He shook his head, distracted by the dishes. I didn't press further, not wanting to seem paranoid again, but my unease was growing. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. Every little creak of the cabin made my nerves jangle. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that the footprints could have been from earlier in the day, even though I knew we hadn't gone to that side of the cabin. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, I knew exactly what had woken me. There was a noise coming from the porch. A slow, deliberate creaking, like someone was walking back and forth. I froze, my heart racing. The sound stopped, and I held my breath, straining to hear. After what felt like an eternity, I heard it again, soft footsteps, this time moving toward the window. I reached out and shook Sam awake. He blinked groggily, confused, but before I could explain, we both heard it. The unmistakable sound of someone trying the doorknob. Sam shot out of bed, his instincts kicking in. He grabbed his flashlight and his service weapon, then motioned for me to stay put. I didn't argue. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint. From the bedroom, I heard him open the front door. "Hello?" he called out, his voice firm and authoritative. There was no response. Minutes passed, each one dragging on forever. Finally, Sam came back in, locking the door behind him. "Nobody's there," he said quietly, but his face was tense. Neither of us slept much after that. The next morning, we found more footprints in the snow. They circled the cabin, stopping at each window. Whoever it was had been watching us. Sam wanted to pack up and leave, but we still had one more night booked, and I didn't want to cut the trip short over what might just be a harmless prank. We spent the day inside, keeping the doors locked. Sam kept his gun within arm's reach at all times. The atmosphere had shifted. The cozy cabin now felt like a trap. That night, I barely slept. Every noise set me on edge, and I kept imagining someone standing just outside the window, watching us. At around 3 a.m., the noises started again. This time, they were louder, footsteps crunching in the snow, moving quickly around the cabin. Sam was already awake, sitting up in bed with his gun in hand. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the front door, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Sam sprang into action, yelling for me to stay put as he ran toward the living room. I huddled under the blankets, trembling, listening to the chaos unfolding just beyond the bedroom door. I heard the sharp crack of a gunshot, then another. My ears were ringing, and my heart felt like it might explode. Then everything went quiet. I waited, paralyzed with fear, until finally, the bedroom door creaked open. It was Sam. His face was pale and he was breathing hard, but he was alive. "They're gone," he said. The next morning, we left the cabin as soon as the sun came up. We didn't talk much on the drive home, and we never reported the incident. Weeks later, Sam told me he'd found a knife lying in the snow outside the cabin, just beneath the window where I'd seen the footprints. Whoever it was hadn't just been watching us, they'd been planning something. To this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that we got out just in time, and I'll never set foot in a cabin again. I never thought much about the isolation of working in a remote cabin deep in the woods, at least not when I first started. Back then, it seemed like the perfect gig. I was 31, living in Maine, and working odd jobs to make ends meet. When the local forestry office posted an opening for a night shift caretaker at one of their remote cabins, I jumped on it. Paid decently, didn't require a college degree, and I figured I could handle being alone for a few nights a week. Besides, how hard could it be? The cabin was about 15 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a single-lane dirt road. It was built in the 1950s and hadn't changed much since then. A single-story structure with 2 small rooms and a tiny kitchen, it served as a base for forestry workers during the day and a lookout post at night. My job was simple: monitor the radios, keep an eye out for illegal logging, and report any unusual activity in the area. It was late November when I took the job. The weather was miserable, rain almost every day, temperatures hovering just above freezing, and the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones. The trees, stripped bare of leaves, cast long, skeletal shadows in the beam of my truck's headlights as I drove to the cabin for my first shift. The road was a mess, thick with mud and deep potholes filled with rainwater. My tires slipped more than once, and I had to keep a tight grip on the wheel to avoid sliding into the ditches that flanked the road. By the time I reached the cabin, my nerves were already frayed. I parked in the small clearing in front of the cabin and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit me immediately, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself as I grabbed my backpack and flashlight from the truck. The cabin looked almost forlorn in the downpour, its wooden exterior darkened by the rain. the windows reflecting the gray sky like empty eyes. Inside, it was no better. The air was damp, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the corners. The only light came from the single bulb hanging from the ceiling in the main room, casting a weak yellow glow. I set my bag down on the worn wooden table and took a quick inventory. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A couple of chairs, a battered desk with a radio set, and a cot with a thin mattress in the corner. A small wood stove sat near the door, its black surface slick with condensation. I started by lighting the stove, fumbling with the matches as my fingers stiffened from the cold. The fire sputtered to life, filling the room with a faint warmth and the smell of burning wood. I checked the radio next, making sure it was working. Static crackled faintly from the speakers, a sound that would soon become my constant companion. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I sat by the stove, listening to the rain hammering against the roof and the occasional burst of static from the radio. I'd brought a book with me to pass the time, but the words blurred together under the dim light, and I found myself glancing at the windows more often than I wanted to admit. The woods outside were pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt almost alive. Around midnight, I heard the first sound that set me on edge. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the rain. A soft, rhythmic tapping. I paused, holding my breath as I strained to hear over the storm. It came again, louder this time, a deliberate knock against the back wall of the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a tree branch swaying in the storm. But when I stepped outside to check, there was nothing there. The rain had turned the ground to thick mud, but there were no tracks, no sign that anyone or anything had been near the cabin. I went back inside, locking the door behind me and stoking the fire to push back the creeping chill. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, seemed amplified in the quiet. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid, that it was the isolation and the storm playing tricks on me. Then the radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, the same white noise I'd been hearing all night. But then, faintly, I thought I heard a voice. It was too distorted to make out the words, but it was there, a low, urgent murmur buried beneath the static. I leaned in, turning the dial to try and clear the signal, but it only grew fainter until it disappeared entirely. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I sat back in the chair, staring at the radio. I told myself it was just interference, maybe a nearby station bleeding through. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There were no stations out here, no towers for miles. The rain eased up around 3 a.m., leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I was about to call it a night when I heard it again, the knocking. This time, it came from the front door, slow and deliberate. My chest tightened as I stared at the door, the weak light from the bulb casting long shadows across the room. I grabbed the flashlight and hesitated for a moment before stepping toward the door. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. But I had to know. I opened the door, and the beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness. The clearing was empty, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the night. The mud was undisturbed, no footprints leading up to the cabin. I stepped outside, sweeping the light across the clearing, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. As I turned to go back inside, something caught my eye, a faint glint of metal near the edge of the clearing. I walked over, my boots sinking into the mud, and knelt to pick it up. It was an old hunting knife, the blade rusted and the handle worn smooth. My stomach turned as I realized it hadn't been there earlier. I went back inside, locking the door and propping a chair under the knob for good measure. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion, every sound sending my heart racing. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up and left without looking back. I quit the job that same day, telling the forestry office I wasn't cut out for it. They didn't ask questions, just nodded and handed me my final paycheck. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint tapping on the walls, and I wonder if I was ever truly alone in that cabin. It was the summer of 1998 when my uncle Julio invited me to join him and his brother-in-law Rafael at a cabin deep in the Andes Mountains. Julio was my mother's older brother, a rugged man in his 40s who spent his life working construction. Rafael, on the other hand, was quieter, more bookish, but still tough in his own way. They were close, despite their differences, and often spent time together hunting, fishing, and exploring remote areas. At the time, I was 22 and eager for adventure. Life in Buenos Aires felt stifling, and the chance to escape into the wilderness sounded perfect. The cabin, Julio said, belonged to a friend who rarely used it. It was deep in the forest, far from the nearest village, reachable only by a bumpy dirt road that wound through the mountains. I was warned that the place was basic, no electricity, no running water, but I didn't mind. I was ready to rough it. The drive to the cabin took nearly a day. The farther we went, the more the world seemed to fall away. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to little more than a faint track through the trees. Julio drove his old pickup, a battered Toyota with a bed full of supplies. Food, water, a generator, tools, and hunting gear. The landscape was breathtaking. Towering peaks loomed above us, their snow-capped summits glinting in the sun. Dense forests of pine and cedar stretched endlessly, their silence broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves. We passed no other vehicles, no signs of life, save for a solitary deer that darted across the road. By the time we arrived, the sun was sinking low. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by trees so thick they seemed to form a wall. It was smaller than I'd imagined, a single-story structure made of dark, weathered wood. There was a porch with a couple of rickety chairs, and the windows were covered with heavy shutters. The isolation was immediate and absolute. No cell service, no electricity poles, not even the faintest hum of civilization. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the creak of the cabin as we unloaded our gear. The cabin's interior was as basic as promised. A single room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space with a separate bedroom at the back. A wood-burning stove dominated one corner, and a single lantern hung from the ceiling. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and dampness. We set to work quickly, unpacking supplies and securing the shutters. Julio insisted on doing a sweep of the perimeter, checking for any signs of wildlife or intruders. Rafael started a fire in the stove while I organized the food and water. That night, we ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread, washed down with whiskey Julio had brought along. The darkness outside was complete, a blackness so profound it seemed to press against the windows. The forest was alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustling of leaves. But inside, the cabin felt safe, almost cozy. The next morning, we set out to explore. Julio wanted to check a nearby stream for fish, while Rafael planned to scout the area for signs of game. I tagged along with Julio, eager to see more of the wilderness. The stream was about a mile from the cabin, a crystal-clear ribbon of water tumbling over smooth stones. We spent hours there, catching trout and enjoying the peaceful solitude. Julio told me stories about his hunting trips, his voice steady and calm, a contrast to the restless energy of the forest. When we returned to the cabin, Rafael was already back. He'd found tracks, deer mostly, but also something larger. He thought it might be a puma. Julio wasn't worried. He said pumas usually avoided humans. Still, we decided to stay alert. That night, something woke me. I couldn't tell what it was at first. A noise, maybe, or just a feeling. The cabin was silent except for the crackling of the dying fire. I listened for a moment, straining to hear anything unusual. Then I caught it. A faint sound, like footsteps, coming from outside. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I glanced at Julio, who was snoring softly in his sleeping bag near the stove. Rafael was in the bedroom, the door slightly ajar. I debated whether to wake them but decided against it. Instead, I crept to the window and peered out through a crack in the shutters. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the clearing, but I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes scanning the darkness. Finally, I told myself it must have been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easily. The following days were uneventful. We spent our time fishing, hunting, and exploring. The forest was beautiful but unforgiving. The trails were steep and narrow, the undergrowth thick and tangled. We found signs of wildlife everywhere. Tracks, scat, claw marks on trees, but saw little beyond the occasional bird or squirrel. Julio and Rafael didn't mention hearing anything unusual, and I decided not to bring it up. I convinced myself it had been my imagination, a trick of the mind in the eerie silence of the forest. On the fourth day, while hiking along a ridge, we found something that made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, or what was left of one. A torn tent lay crumpled on the ground, its poles snapped. Scattered around it were belongings. A backpack, a cooking pot, a pair of hiking boots. Everything was covered in dirt and leaves, as if it had been there for weeks. There were no signs of the camper, no blood, no tracks leading away. Just the eerie remains of a camp that had been violently abandoned. Julio and Rafael exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. We decided to head back to the cabin. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. They circled the cabin again and again, stopping occasionally as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening, watching. Julio was awake now, sitting by the stove with his rifle across his lap. Rafael stood near the door, clutching a hunting knife. I stayed by the window, peering into the darkness. The moonlight revealed nothing, just the endless sea of trees. Then, a sound shattered the silence. A loud crash, like something heavy falling against the side of the cabin. We all jumped, our hearts racing. Julio moved to the door, his hand on the latch, but Rafael stopped him. We waited, holding our breath, as the seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, the sound stopped. The footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the pounding of my heart. At first light, we went outside to investigate. The ground around the cabin was a mess of footprints, too large to be human. Deep gouges marked the wooden walls, as if something had tried to claw its way in. Nearby, we found the remains of a deer, its body torn apart and scattered. Julio and Rafael decided it wasn't safe to stay. We packed up quickly, throwing our gear into the truck and leaving the cabin behind. The drive back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. I never found out what had been out there. Maybe it was a puma, or maybe something else, something I couldn't explain. All I know is that I've never felt fear like I did in that cabin, surrounded by the endless forest and the unknown. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. I remember the exact moment the email came in. It was late January, and I was sitting at my desk in a small university lab. Snow was falling outside, covering the city in a quiet, white blanket. I had spent weeks applying for grants, researching rare venomous snakes, and trying to find a field location to collect samples. When I opened the email, my heart skipped a beat. It was from a research partner I'd met at a conference years ago. He mentioned a cabin deep in the forests of northern Georgia, where he claimed locals had spotted a previously undocumented species of viper. It was precisely the kind of discovery I had been looking for. The message was vague but compelling. He provided GPS coordinates and wrote that the property had been abandoned for decades, left untouched, and perfect for studying wildlife. He signed off with a single line, "Take precautions. It's an isolated area." I ignored the slight unease the warning gave me. For years, I had been chasing breakthroughs in venom research. Rare snakes were my specialty, and the opportunity was too good to pass up. I packed my gear: snake hooks, specimen jars, a portable fridge for venom samples, and enough food and water for a week. I drove south, leaving the snow behind. The air turned warmer, the roads narrower, and the towns fewer. By the time I reached the coordinates, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and lined with trees that looked like they had been standing there for centuries. The cabin appeared at the end of the path, a small single-story structure made of dark wood, its roof sagging under the weight of moss. It looked ancient, almost forgotten. Surrounding it was a clearing filled with overgrown bushes and leaf litter. I felt a twinge of apprehension as I stepped out of the car. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. I shook off the feeling, grabbed my backpack, and approached the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a single large room with a fireplace, a few broken chairs, and a table. Dust coated every surface. I spent the first night setting up my equipment and preparing for the fieldwork. The cabin had no electricity, so I relied on my headlamp and portable batteries. The forest was dense, and I knew it would be challenging to locate the snakes, but I had done this before in other remote areas. What I didn't know was how much this trip would test me. The next day, I ventured into the woods, following trails that seemed more like animal paths than anything made by humans. The forest was alive with sounds: birds, insects, and the occasional rustle of something larger. After hours of searching, I spotted my first snake, a copperhead coiled beneath a log. It wasn't what I was looking for, but it was a good sign that venomous snakes were active in the area. By the third day, I had found several common species, but nothing unusual. The forest was dense and challenging to navigate, and I had to rely on my GPS to avoid getting lost. My supplies were holding up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. On the fourth day, I stumbled across something that stopped me in my tracks. Deep in the woods, far from any path, I found a shed snake skin draped over a bush. It was massive, easily the largest I had ever seen. The scale pattern was unlike anything I recognized, and it shimmered slightly in the sunlight. I carefully collected it, my heart pounding with excitement. If this was from a new species, it would be a monumental discovery. That night, I returned to the cabin and spread the skin out on the table to examine it under my portable lamp. The scales were iridescent, and the size suggested a snake at least 7 feet long. But what struck me the most was the odd shape of the head portion. It didn't match the anatomy of any snake I had studied. As I worked, I heard a faint noise outside, a soft, rhythmic rustling, like something moving through the dry leaves. I froze, every instinct telling me not to move. The sound grew louder, circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it toward the nearest window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but I saw nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but deep down I didn't believe it. The rustling had been too deliberate, too steady. The following morning, I decided to search the area around the cabin for signs of the snake. I followed the noise I had heard the previous night and soon came across a large patch of flattened grass and disturbed leaves. In the middle of the clearing was a strange mark in the soil, a long, winding groove as if something heavy had been dragged through the dirt. I followed the trail deeper into the forest, where it led to a large, hollowed-out log. As I approached, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air seemed heavier, and the forest had gone silent again. Carefully, I used my snake hook to probe the log. The reaction was immediate. Something large and fast shot out of the log, its movement almost too quick to follow. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Whatever it was, it disappeared into the underbrush before I could get a clear look. That night was worse. The rustling returned, louder and closer than before. I barricaded the door with one of the broken chairs and kept my flashlight and a knife by my side. Around midnight, I heard a thud against the cabin wall, followed by another. It sounded like something was testing the structure, looking for a way in. I didn't sleep. On the 6th day, I found what I had been looking for. Deep in the forest, I discovered a burrow at the base of a large tree. The entrance was wide, and the soil around it was disturbed, littered with bones. Small animals, maybe, but too many for comfort. I set up my camera and a bait trap, hoping to lure the snake out. I stayed hidden a short distance away, waiting. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker as the sun set. Just as I was about to give up, I saw it. The snake emerged from the burrow, and it was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its body was thick, its scales a deep, almost black green that shimmered in the fading light. Its head was broad, with piercing, unblinking eyes. But what struck me the most was its size. It was enormous, at least 10 feet long. It moved with a terrifying grace, its body gliding over the ground. I watched in awe and fear, frozen in place. I had found what I was looking for, but I wasn't prepared for the reality of it. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing. I knew I had to leave and report my findings, but something about the snake didn't feel right. It wasn't just its size or appearance. It was the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes. That night, the rustling outside grew louder. Then came the thuds, harder and more frequent. The walls of the cabin groaned under the force. I realized, with growing horror, that the snake wasn't just an animal. It was hunting me. I don't remember much about how I escaped. I grabbed my gear and ran, abandoning the cabin and my car, plunging into the forest. The sound of the snake's body moving through the leaves followed me, relentless. I ran until I reached a main road, where a passing trucker stopped and called for help. Weeks later, after I recovered, I tried to report what I had seen, but without physical evidence, no one believed me. The cabin and its surrounding woods remain untouched, the perfect hiding place for something that shouldn't exist. And I know it's still out there, waiting for the next person to wander too close. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the noise of the city and spend a few days alone at my family's old cabin. The place was tucked deep in the woods, far from any main road or town. It had been years since anyone used it. My dad used to bring me here when I was a kid to fish and hike, but after he passed, the cabin just sat there, forgotten. I figured a few quiet days surrounded by nature might do me some good. The drive out there took longer than I remembered. Gravel roads stretched on for miles, cutting through thick forests that seemed to get darker the farther I went. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place looked the same as I remembered. Small, weathered, and surrounded by towering pines. A rusted metal roof and faded wooden planks gave it a look of neglect, but it felt familiar. I parked my truck a few feet from the front steps and hauled my supplies inside. The cabin smelled damp, like wood and mildew. There was a single main room with a small kitchenette, a creaky old bed in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs. The windows were cloudy with grime, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. I set my bag down and started cleaning up, sweeping away years of dust and debris. It wasn't much, but it was cozy in its own way. After an hour or so, the place looked livable. I unpacked some food and set up my lanterns since the cabin didn't have electricity. Outside, the forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I sat on the front porch for a while, just listening to the wind and letting my mind wander. It felt good to be away from everything. That night, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sound of the rain tapping against the metal roof. It started as a soft drizzle but grew heavier as the hours passed. The sound was comforting at first, but something about the steady rhythm made me restless. I woke up around midnight, unsure of what had stirred me. The rain was pouring hard now, and the wind howled through the trees. I lay there, staring at the ceiling when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the storm. It was coming from outside, a muffled crunching noise, like footsteps on wet ground. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and I drifted back to sleep, convincing myself it was nothing. The next morning, I stepped outside to find the ground soaked and the air heavy with the smell of rain. I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing. Footprints. They weren't fresh, but they were distinct, pressed into the wet dirt. They looked human, but there was no reason anyone would be out here. The cabin was miles from the nearest house or road. I tried not to dwell on it and spent the day exploring the woods, sticking close to familiar trails. The rain had made everything slick, and the forest felt eerily quiet. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky was gray, and the rain had started up again. I spent the evening reading and trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping over me. That night, the rain came down harder than before. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the same noise, footsteps. This time, they were closer. I sat up, straining to hear over the storm. The sound stopped just as suddenly as it started. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window, but all I could see was the rain. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was probably an animal again. The next morning, I decided to check the area around the cabin. Sure enough, there were more footprints, fresh this time. They circled the cabin, stopping near the windows and the front porch. My chest tightened as I realized someone had been watching me. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, more vulnerable. I spent the day inside, listening to the rain and jumping at every little sound. By nightfall, I was on edge, barely able to keep still. I set up a makeshift barricade against the front door, piling chairs and my bag in front of it. I kept my flashlight and a hunting knife close, just in case. The rain didn't let up that night, and neither did the noises. I heard movement outside, faint but deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was, they were back. I stayed awake, clutching the knife, listening as the footsteps circled the cabin again and again. At one point, I thought I heard breathing near the window. My flashlight revealed nothing but streaks of rain on the glass. Morning came, but the storm didn't let up. I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I packed up my things quickly, keeping an eye on the windows. As I stepped onto the porch, I felt like I was being watched. The forest was still, the air heavy with moisture. The only sound was the rain hitting the trees. I made my way to the truck, gripping my keys tightly. That's when I saw it, scratches on the driver's side door. Long, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped. I climbed in, started the engine, and didn't look back. The drive out of the woods felt longer than ever. The rain made the road slippery, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something. When I finally reached the main road, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I never went back to the cabin after that. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to know. Even now, years later, the memory still haunts me. Sometimes, when it rains at night, I catch myself listening for footsteps in the dark. It was the dead of winter, the kind of cold that bites deep and doesn't let go. My fiancée, Lily, and I had decided to rent a remote cabin for the weekend. We'd been working through some stress lately. Wedding planning, work demands, and just the daily grind. It seemed like a good idea to get away from it all. She had convinced her gym trainer, Mark, to join us. He was one of those overly enthusiastic types who swore by outdoor workouts and winter survival skills. The idea was to balance relaxation with some physical activity, which Mark was all too eager to lead. The cabin was tucked away in the Adirondack Mountains, miles from civilization. It was an old place, the kind that looked charming in photos but felt a bit too isolated in person. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the treetops. The driveway was a narrow path carved through dense woods, barely wide enough for the SUV we'd borrowed for the trip. The cabin itself was modest. A living room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. It had been built decades ago, and while it was updated enough to have electricity and running water, it still carried the creaks and groans of something aged and weathered. Outside, the snow was already several feet deep, and the forecast promised more. Mark, ever the fitness enthusiast, immediately scoped out the surrounding area for potential workout spots. Meanwhile, Lily and I unpacked and settled in. By the time we had a fire going, the darkness outside was absolute. The silence was unnerving. No cars, no neighbors, just the occasional howl of wind through the trees. That night, we sat around the fireplace. Mark outlined his plans for the weekend: hikes, snowshoeing, and even an attempt at building an emergency snow shelter. I wasn't thrilled, but Lily seemed excited, so I went along with it. Besides, I figured a little physical activity wouldn't hurt. The next morning, we woke up to a fresh blanket of snow. The sun was out, and the landscape looked like something out of a postcard. Mark wasted no time getting us geared up. He had brought snowshoes, hiking poles, and even a sled for carrying supplies. We set out mid-morning, trudging through the woods in single file. First, it was enjoyable. The cold air was invigorating, and the scenery was breathtaking. But as the hours passed, the novelty wore off. The snow was deeper than expected, and the terrain was rough. Mark led the way, his energy seemingly endless, while I struggled to keep up. Lily was somewhere in between, clearly enjoying herself but starting to tire. We stopped for lunch near a frozen creek. Mark demonstrated how to check the ice's thickness, proudly proclaiming it safe to walk on. I stayed on the bank, not entirely trusting his confidence. As we ate, clouds began to roll in, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Mark assured us we had plenty of time to get back to the cabin before dark. But the hike back was slower. The trail we had made earlier was already filling with fresh snow, and the wind had picked up. By the time we reached the cabin, the sky was a dull gray, and the first flakes of a new snowfall were drifting down. My legs were sore, and I was more than ready to call it a day. That night, as the storm intensified, I noticed something odd. The cabin was colder than it should have been, even with the fire roaring. I chalked it up to the old structure and the worsening weather, but a part of me felt uneasy. The wind howled like a living thing, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to shift and dance in unnatural ways. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, we discovered the snow had piled up overnight, nearly burying the SUV. Mark, undeterred, suggested we use the day to build a snow shelter. He claimed it would be a valuable survival skill and a fun challenge. I wasn't convinced, but went along with it to keep the peace. We spent hours carving out a dome-shaped shelter in a snowdrift a few hundred feet from the cabin. It was hard, cold work, and by the time it was finished, I was exhausted. Mark, however, seemed energized, his enthusiasm undiminished. He even suggested we test the shelter by sleeping in it that night. I refused outright, and Lily agreed we'd be better off in the cabin. That evening, the storm worsened. The wind was relentless, shaking the windows and causing the trees to groan under the weight of the snow. Mark insisted on checking the shelter one last time before bed, claiming it could collapse under the weight of the storm. I thought he was crazy to go out in those conditions, but he was insistent. He didn't come back. At first, we assumed he was just taking his time, maybe caught up in some final adjustments. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, I began to worry. I bundled up and grabbed a flashlight, determined to find him. Lily begged me not to go, but I couldn't just sit there. The snow was blinding, and the wind stole the breath from my lungs. The beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. I made my way toward the shelter, calling Mark's name. When I reached it, I found it intact but empty. There was no sign of him anywhere. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing. Lily was frantic, and I was at a loss for what to do. The storm made it impossible to drive or call for help. We were completely cut off. We spent the night huddled by the fire, jumping at every sound. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside, but when I looked, there was nothing there. The storm finally began to subside around dawn, but Mark was still missing. I decided to search again, this time in daylight. The fresh snow had covered any tracks, and the woods felt eerily silent, as if holding their breath. I searched for hours, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. There was no trace of him. When I returned to the cabin, I found Lily staring at something on the floor. It was a single boot, partially melted, as if it had been placed too close to the fire. It wasn't ours. Mark's fate remains a mystery. Search teams combed the area but found nothing. The cabin was abandoned after that weekend, left to decay in the relentless wilderness. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there, and I can't explain how that boot ended up inside. I've always been drawn to quiet places, the kind of spots where you can hear the wind through the trees and feel the world slow down. That's why I agreed when a friend of mine suggested I rent a remote cabin for a week to clear my head. I'd been working long hours at my job in Chicago, and the stress had been eating away at me. A week alone in the woods sounded like the perfect escape. The cabin was deep in the Ozarks, about 10 miles from the nearest paved road. The online listing described it as rustic but cozy, and I was sold on the pictures of a small wooden house surrounded by thick forest. It looked peaceful, quiet, just what I needed. I arrived in early November, a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving. The trees were mostly bare, their leaves scattered in a thick carpet across the ground. The drive out there had been rough. My car wasn't exactly built for dirt roads, and some parts of the path were so narrow I worried about scraping the sides on branches. But when I pulled up to the cabin, all my doubts faded. It was picture perfect. A one-room wooden structure with a stone chimney and a small front porch. Behind it, the forest stretched out in every direction, a mix of oak and pine that seemed to go on forever. There wasn't another soul in sight. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. Inside, the cabin was simple. A twin bed sat in one corner, covered with a plaid blanket that smelled faintly of cedar. There was a small kitchenette with a propane stove and a sink that pulled water from a rain barrel outside. A cast iron wood stove stood in the center of the room, its chimney pipe disappearing into the roof. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 yards from the cabin, which I wasn't thrilled about, but I figured I could manage for a week. I spent my first day settling in. I unpacked my groceries, stocked the small cooler with the perishable items I'd brought, and chopped some wood for the stove. As the sun set, the temperature dropped quickly. I was glad I'd brought plenty of layers and a good sleeping bag. I lit the stove and sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth as I flipped through a book I'd brought. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves outside. I woke up the next morning feeling refreshed, eager to spend the day exploring the woods. The forest was beautiful in the daylight. I followed a faint trail that wound its way through the trees, crunching over fallen leaves and stepping over roots. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine and earth. I lost track of time as I wandered, eventually stumbling upon a small creek that trickled over smooth stones. I knelt down to take a drink, the cold water tasting like it had been filtered through the rocks themselves. I made it back to the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon. My legs were sore, but it was a good kind of tired. I lit the wood stove again, cooked a simple dinner, and settled in for another quiet night. It was around midnight when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent, the only sound the faint crackle of the dying fire in the stove. Then I heard it, a faint noise, like something scraping against the side of the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate scrape that sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the wood. The wind had picked up a little, and the trees were close enough that their limbs could easily reach the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I got up, grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the table, and shone it through the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees outside. Nothing. I exhaled, telling myself I was being paranoid. I climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound seemed magnified in the quiet, and I couldn't stop thinking about the scraping noise. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. The next morning, I went outside to check the cabin's exterior. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I felt like I needed to do something to put my mind at ease. Sure enough, there were faint scratches on the wood near the front corner of the cabin. They were thin, like they'd been made by a branch, but the strange part was the height. They were low, only about 2 feet off the ground, in a spot where no branches could have reached. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease that had settled in my chest. Maybe a raccoon or some other animal had been poking around during the night. It wasn't uncommon for wildlife to get curious about human smells. I spent the rest of the day hiking again, trying to push the incident out of my mind. But when night fell, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. The next few nights followed the same pattern. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to strange noises, scraping, faint thuds, and once, what sounded like a soft tapping on the window. Each time, I'd shine my flashlight outside and see nothing. By the fourth night, I was starting to feel a little frayed. I hadn't gotten a full night's sleep since I'd arrived, and my nerves were on edge. I decided to cut my trip short. One more night, I told myself, and I'd head back to the city in the morning. That night, I was extra cautious. I made sure the door was locked and slid a chair under the handle for good measure. I even kept my hatchet within arm's reach, just in case. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a noise that woke me, but a feeling, the kind of prickling sensation you get when someone's watching you. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows on the walls. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. My heart stopped. The sound hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside the cabin. I gripped the hatchet tightly, barely daring to breathe. The creak came again, closer this time. My eyes darted to the door. The chair was still in place, the lock untouched. Then I realized where the sound was coming from: the crawl space beneath the cabin. I'd noticed the small, hinged door in the floor when I first arrived, but hadn't thought much of it. The listing had mentioned a storage area for firewood, but I hadn't needed to use it. Now, the thought of what might be down there made my blood run cold. Slowly, I slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The hatchet felt heavy in my hand as I approached the trapdoor. My flashlight was on the table, but I didn't dare turn it on. I didn't want to give myself away. I knelt down, my pulse hammering in my ears, and pressed my ear to the wood. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard breathing. Not the quick, shallow breaths of an animal. This was slow and measured, like someone trying to stay quiet. I shot to my feet, my heart racing. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the trapdoor. My hand fumbled for the latch, but I stopped when I heard another sound. The breathing had stopped. Now there was movement, the faint sound of someone or something shifting below me. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I yanked the chair away from the door, threw it open, and sprinted into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the keys into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I threw it into reverse and sped down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides as I went. I didn't look back. The next day, I called the property owner to tell them what had happened. They seemed genuinely surprised, apologizing profusely and promising to look into it. I never heard back. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that crawl space. I don't think I want to know. All I know is that I'll never rent another cabin again.